accessible to the widest extent possible for research, education and enjoyment. Our remit is to collect public records, that is, those created by the Chorla and its predecessors, as well as other archives offered as gifts or deposits by organisations, businesses or individuals, so long as these relate to the Western Isles. By placing the archives in a secure and stable environment and providing access to them in a way which protects them, we thereby ensure their survival for future generations, as well as supporting the Chorla and meeting its legal obligations under the Public Records Act and other record-keeping obligations. So now to the actual historical sources. Perhaps it would be appropriate to begin with the charters, which are the foundation documents for establishing the civic history of the borough of Stornoway. On this slide, I have summarised the charters relevant to Stornoway that are known to be in existence. So we have the Charter of 1607, for example, by King James VI to Lord Balmerino and others, who were known as the Gentlemen Adventurers of Fife. And that's a charter which grants Borough of Barony status to Stornoway, amongst other provisions relating to Lewis more generally. There's then known to be a charter of 1825 establishing the Town Council of the Borough of Barony of Stornoway, and there are various charters in between those two dates, although I can't really claim to know all of them that are relevant. So that's what we knew in terms of the charters that existed. But we didn't have any of these in the archive at the start of the year. However, earlier this year, while visiting a council store to look at the backlog of old records, I noticed among the morass of very uninteresting boxes, 2 boxes right up on a top shelf marked legal deeds, and I asked if these could be transferred to the archive for review. When we received them, lo and behold, we were amazed to find in these boxes what appeared to be an original charter. This is a photo of the charter as we found it before conservation treatment. As you can perhaps see, due to having been stored in the wrong environment for a long time, the charter had become very brittle as the parchment had dried out. And due to its condition, it was very frustratingly impossible to open it for some time. However, in the same box, we found a registered extract of the King James VI Charter of 1607, so you will understand our excitement. This is the charter after conservation treatment. Thanks to the excellent work of our museum conservation officer, Jane Hamill, the parchment was rehumidified and cleaned, and then after several months, we were eventually able to open it. So on finally being able to open it, it was very disappointing. Well, in some ways it was disappointing that it was actually the 1825 charter that was inside the pages and not the 1607 one. But thanks to the discovery of the registered extract of the earlier one and a translation from Latin into English, both of which seem to have been done for the Borough Clerk of Stornoway in 1933, we now know a bit more about the 1607 document. The charter granted by King James VI on 16th October 1607 to Lord Balmerino, Lord George Hay of Nethercliff and James Spence of Wormiston and their heirs. So these were the charter provisions included in the 1607 document. The charter ordained the town adjacent to the castle, and we know that that would be the old castle, into a free borough of barony in order that people visiting would be received and treated with more suitable hospitality. So I'm not sure what the hospitality was like before 1607. It stated that the borough's inhabitants would have full and free power and liberty of buying and selling within the borough wine, wax, cloth, both broad and narrow, garments coloured and shorn, cheap and dear, along with all other merchandise, and to have bakers, brewers, sellers of whisky, butchers, fishers, and all other craftsmen pertaining to a free borough. It also stipulated there would be a market cross to be established and markets to be held every Saturday, as well as 2 annual free fairs on St Andrew's Day and St George's Day. I was a bit surprised to see St George's Day, but then I remembered this was after the Union of the Crowns, so I'm guessing King James VI wanted to keep in with his subjects in England as well. So now moving on to the later charter, the one of 1825. This was granted by the Honourable Mary Frederica Elizabeth Stewart Mackenzie of Seaforth, with the special advice and consent of her husband, in August 1825 to the feuars and burgesses of the borough of Barony of Stornoway. It refers back to the earlier charter of King James VI, and it stated that it was now necessary to put the police and government of the borough under proper regulations. These are more of the charter provisions, so it specified the constitution of the borough council, 9 people, it doesn't say people, it just says 9. 9 to be chosen from amongst the feuars and burgesses, of which 2 to be bailies, 1 treasurer, and the remaining 6 to be councillors. It specifies when and how elections were to be held, and the provision for annual removal and re-election of post holders. It also mentions that those elected had to be actual residenters within the town of Stornoway, and those admitted as free burgesses, which it defined as merchants and all kinds of tradesmen, were to be charged no more than 30 merks Scots. And then finally, it granted the powers to manage the public funds, administer justice, maintain peace and good order, and choose various officers it was deemed necessary to run the council. I've actually done a full transcript of this charter, and I'm hoping that I can make copies available at some point, possibly in the form of a small booklet for people to buy, because we've been told we have to raise income for the service. So I've just done a few photos to let you see the handwriting close up, but I'll just jump through quickly. So that's what the writing looks like on the parchment, and that's just an extract. And you can see the ribbons there at the bottom. Unfortunately, there should have been a seal attached to those ribbons, but that seal we didn't find that, unfortunately. And that's the last page of the charter with the seals and the signatures and the official stamp. So that's the 1825 charter. So we then, in terms of Stornoway as a borough and its civic history, we then have a gap in the records between 1825 and when the next borough council came along in 1863. And unfortunately, it doesn't seem that there's any records relating to that time. We do know a town council existed at least in 1834, because a government commission, a parliamentary commission was set up to look at municipal corporations in Scotland. A report was done to both houses of parliament and published in 1835. This report mentions Stornoway. It mentions there was a population of about 3,500 people. It also mentions that there had been a public quay built by subscription, which was afterwards made over to the town council in 1831. And also that annual accounts were kept by the treasurer, examined and passed by the magistrates and town council, and were open to the inspection of the community. And the inquiries questionnaire was submitted by Mr. Roderick Morrison, the acting chief magistrate, in February 1834. So there clearly was a council there, but I don't know where the records are. Now, moving on to the next incarnation, if you like, of the town council. We've got the borough records resuming in 1863 with the police commissioners of the borough of Stornoway. This is a summary of the records of that body which still survives. So we have minute books, letter book, financial records, and there are another 2 organisations that are vaguely related to this police commissioners of the borough. So There was an Act of Parliament passed in 1862 called the General and Police Improvement Scotland Act, under which householders could vote to establish a borough council consisting of elected police commissioners. And under the Act, these were the sort of powers that these were the sort of purposes that they could use the Act for. So they could collect money and use it for lighting streets by gas or other means, paving and cleansing the streets, distributing water and gas, preventing infectious disease, and employing collectors, clerks, constables, etc., police officers. But my question there in red is what was actually really going on? Was that the reason they decided to establish a council suddenly in 1863? Having looked through the minutes of the first few years of this body, I believe there's a lot more going on than meets the eye. The first 50 pages or so of the minute book contain many letters of complaint received by the borough commissioners from the notorious Donald Munro, Chamberlain of James Matheson. And the early minutes seem to suggest that the borough commissioners were possibly trying to establish themselves in opposition to Munro and Matheson. It is known that James Matheson had used his influence in Parliament to purchase the foreshore, and that in January 1863, Donald Munro had issued letters on behalf of Sir James Matheson to the feuars who owned the piers, banning them from carrying out fish curing or boat building, nor could they let these to others during the fishing season. If they had obeyed these orders, a good many of them would have been financially ruined. So, if we look at the signatories of the householders who signed the petition to establish the borough, you will notice that almost all of them are feuars. Sorry, got my slides mixed up there. So these were the signatories to the petition to establish the borough: Kenneth Smith Feuar, Norman McKeever Feuar, and so on. So some of you who are very familiar with the history of Stornoway will probably know more than me about who these people were and whether their principal business was in the fishing and curing. But it's my suspicion that this was them trying to get some sort of control over what was happening. And it's notable that the first action that the embryo borough council took was to get a ruling on the borough boundaries from Sheriff Cook. Now it was important because the act that set up, the act under which the people could set up the borough, enabled the people who wanted to set it up to get a ruling on the boundaries from a sheriff rather than have to go to an Act of Parliament, which cost a lot of money. Whereas Sir James Matheson had gone to Parliament to buy the foreshore, basically. So they were trying to get round, this is my theory anyway, that they were using this act to try and get round James Matheson and Donald Munro. I've just put in a few examples of the sort of complaints that are reported in the minute book. So the clerk read a letter from Mr. Donald Munro, Re-Inspector of Nuisance. The meeting did not feel called upon to interfere in any way with the resolution of the parochial board. That's the meeting appointed Messrs McKeever, Smith and Malcolm Mackenzie as a committee to confer with Mr. Munro in regard to 1, the roads as mentioned in his said letter, 2, in regard to market stands, and 3, in regard to curing stations on South Beach. And this is just another example. The clerk reported that owing to a letter from Mr. Munro to Mr. McKeever as to curing stances, he and the cleansing committee fixed a thoroughfare of 20 feet in South Beach Street, and the clerk, by their directions, issued a printed notice of police regulations for the ensuing fishing season. So it's quite important to understand in the context of this organisation that they don't mean police in the way that we would mean police. The police could be policing the sanitary conditions of the town, policing the streets and making sure people weren't putting their manure in the wrong places and things like that. So it's not the sort of police that we envisage nowadays. So This is another one. There was produced and read a letter from Mr. Monroe dated 15 July 1864 of a nuisance at the landing steps, and the clerk was directed to give the necessary instructions to the inspector to obviate it so far as possible, and to reply to Mr. Monroe's letter that this had been done. So it's pretty clear from these minutes that Donald Monroe was hounding the Borough Police Commissioners. That's just a few examples from the first 50 pages. So then the next sort of point to note about this police borough is that at the same time, roughly as the Borough Council was being set up, there was also steps to establish the Stornoway Pier and Harbour Commission, and that was really an initiative under James Matheson's sort of tutelage, because he was trying to control what was going on with the piers at the foreshore. And it's interesting to note that there were police commissioner representatives elected to the Pier and Harbour Commission as well. So I think what's going on is a bit of a power struggle within the town. And I've called this slide Monroe Shenanigans. It's pretty clear also from the record that Monroe could not tolerate an alternative source of authority to himself being established to control matters in the town. And there are a number of mysterious entries in the minutes. So for example, at Stornoway upon the 28th day of April 1865, at a special meeting of the police commissioners called conform to execution of citation produced. So it would appear that Monroe had produced a citation to convene a meeting in order to point out that, in his opinion, one of the police commissioners who had been selected to sit on the Pier and Harbour Commission was ineligible. There is then in the minute book an entry stating that, as Donald Monroe had indicated he could not attend, the meeting would be called off. Now, this was a bit puzzling to me because Donald Monroe wasn't actually on this council, so it would appear that he was trying to make sure that he was putting himself in it. At the next meeting on the 4th of May, he's recorded as being present at the meeting. Then on the 24th of June, a letter received from Mr. Monroe that officially from home, and in consequence of the total absence of commissioners, the meeting fell. On the 10th of July, the minute book records no other commissioners having appeared and no explanation received from those absent adjourned this meeting till 7 o'clock evening. And that meeting was actually signed by Donald Monroe himself, so he was the only person that turned up to that meeting. So from May 1865 onwards, he is regularly attending the meetings. And as I was saying, I'm not quite sure how he was eligible to attend, but it's possibly because he was a Baron Bailie. And it's clear from the records that he continued to be a thorn in the side of the Borough Council until his resignation about 10 years later. So this particular minute book is well worth consulting just to find out what's going on with the various power struggles in the town at the time and how these were playing out. It is much more than what it appears on the cover, and it's not just a minute book about paving, cleaning, lighting and the town's water supply, which you would think when you see the entry in the catalogue. So moving on to some different types of records, I'm going to talk a little bit about records relating to public health. These are another very interesting source of information for the history of the town. These are spread through a range of records in the Tasglann. The records came about really as a result of the Public Health Act of 1867 and later legislation relating to public health. I've mentioned there's something that we don't have in the Tasglann, but it's available on the web, which is the Durer Commission evidence. I'm not sure if you're aware of the Durer Commission, but this was set up as a parliamentary commission to go round the Highlands and Islands in 1912 to find out the health conditions of the people. And they sat in Stornoway and in other parts of the Western Isles to take evidence from the doctors. And all that evidence has now been put online, and it's very interesting to find out the sort of challenges that people were encountering in terms of getting access to medical care. Also, as a result of the Durer Commission, the Highlands and Islands Medical Service was set up in 1913, which was a forerunner of the NHS, so it's a really interesting document. Other records we have, just in continuing the public health theme, so we've got the Public Health Letter Book, the Police and Water Ledger, which sounds a bit boring, but it is very interesting. And there's lots about the Borough Horse, which Shona, I should have mentioned earlier, Shona, who's sitting here at the front, is my archives trainee, Shona McClellan. And yeah, we've had quite a lot of fun exploring some of these records. We've got a sewers ledger and a plan of the drains of Stornoway from 1904, which again could be interesting. I haven't actually had a look at it yet. So the sort of matters and the sort of topics you'll find referred to in these records from about the 1860s onwards are the sort of things you would expect from public health, like what were they doing about privies, purifying the water, how they were dealing with issues with wells and contaminated water, pavements, improving the sewers, dealing with disease outbreaks, building hospitals, employing doctors and nurses, employing a scavenger. I found one entry in the minute book which said, agreed to purchase shovel for scavenger, which was very reassuring. The Borough Horse, which is our favourite topic, housing and school hygiene. So there is masses of information in all of these records about those sorts of topics. I also thought it might be interesting to mention the 1867 public health definition of a nuisance, because nowadays we just think a nuisance is a minor sort of annoyance, but with it being an Act of Parliament and a piece of legislation, it's very strictly defined as in terms of what constitutes a nuisance. And these are just some of the matters that they were discussing. So any insufficiency of size, structural defect, want of repair or proper drainage of suitable water closet or privy accommodation or cesspool, rendering premises injurious to health. Any pool, watercourse, ditch, gutter, drain, sewer, privy, urinal, cesspool or ash pit, so foul as to be injurious to health, or any well or other water supply used as a beverage or in the preparation of human food, the water of which is so tainted with impurities or otherwise unwholesome as to be injurious to the health of the persons using it, or calculate to promote or aggravate epidemic disease. And there's lots and lots in that legislation about manure and other offensive matter being within 50 yards of any dwelling house, or any accumulation of police manure, I'm not quite sure what police manure was, within a quarter of a mile of the borough boundaries. So the Public Health Act 1867 sounds a bit boring, but it's actually quite interesting. And I've just included a couple of examples of the sort of letters that are in the Public Health Letter Book. So for example, we've got one there, 14th of August 1876. Dear Sir, it has been reported to Mr. Mackay Chamberlain and Junior Magistrate that several cases of fever are in the house in Keith Street called the Hogue. I'm not sure if anyone here knows what that was referring to. I am desired to request you to inquire into this and to report immediately that the local authority may give instructions on the subject. Yours truly, John Ross, and that was written to Superintendent Cameron, the sanitary inspector. The next example I was going to show you was this from Stornoway, 16th August 1883. Dear Sirs, I have been instructed by a meeting which was held today of the local authority for the town to send for your information and guidance the enclosed copy of directions and regulations by the Board of Supervision in relation to rags from Egypt. Also, copy memorandum on the same subject by the Local Government Board, London. A copy of each of the above has been sent to the sanitary inspector. And that letter was sent to Drs Miller and McRae. So I'm not quite sure what the issue was with rags from Egypt, but maybe they were using those rags for bandages and so on, and maybe there was some sort of problem with them. So the lecture book itself is also very interesting. Moving on to another topic which features heavily in the records of the Tasglann, which is education. As you can imagine, we have lots of sources relevant to the study of the history of education in Stornoway, and I have summarised just some of these on this slide. So we have the Stornoway School Board records, the Lewis District Committee, which includes the minutes of the Technical Education Subcommittee, Lewis Education District Subcommittee, and the trustees of the Nicholson Institution Stornoway, as well as the records of individual schools such as logbooks, admission and attendance registers. Now, looking in more detail at Stornoway School Board in particular, the sort of information and information about the salaries paid and working conditions, information about infectious disease outbreaks which caused schools to close, bursaries, curriculum developments, correspondence with the education authorities in Edinburgh, inspection reports, and what was called enforcements. And that was the Education Scotland Act of 1872 was the first piece of legislation which made education compulsory, and that was for children between 5 and 13. So they had to employ an officer called the compulsory officer who would follow up with individual schools' parents who weren't sending their children to school regularly enough. And in the minute books you have lists of the defaulting parents who had to go in front of the school board and give the reasons for the non-attendance of their children. And sometimes the parents were fined, but mostly they tried not to fine parents because they realised that most people had very, very little money. So a lot of the time the parents were just asked if they could ensure that their children were made to go to school more regularly in future. Other points of information in the minutes would be any difficulties the board had to contend with in implementing the Act, complaints from parents about mistreatment of children by teachers or other school staff, and board finances. So, as well as the history of education itself, it's worth thinking about how these records could be used for a range of different research subjects. For example, weather events. Quite often in the school logbooks, it reports on extreme weather conditions that have caused the schools to close. Outbreaks of disease, customs and traditions. So some logbooks may say things like there was a wedding in the village and no children appeared for 5 days, or information like that. General social conditions of the population. You could use them to research employment practices, historical pay and social attitudes. So I thought I'd just show you a few extracts from the first minute book of the Stornoway School Board. So I've just put this one up. This was the very first meeting held on 16th of April 1873, and you can see first person's name on the school board listed there is Donald Munro, Chamberlain of the Lewis Stornoway. He appears to be in everything. Then there is Reverend Donald McMaster, Free Church Minister Back, the Reverend Malcolm McCritchie, Free Church Minister Garibos, Reverend Charles McEwing, Minister of the United Presbyterian Church Stornoway, Kenneth Mackenzie, Bank Agent Stornoway, Kenneth Smith, Merchant and Fish Curer Stornoway, and Charles Mackenzie McRae, MD Stornoway. So quite mostly in all of the any official bodies of this period, it's usually doctors, merchants and people like that that are on the board. So I thought I'd just show you that. Oh, the other interesting point about this is that in most school boards you would expect there to be Church of Scotland ministers because of the close relationship between the Church of Scotland and the sort of development of education in Scotland. But in this case it's quite interesting to note that we had 2 Free Church ministers and someone from the United Presbyterian Church. So that's quite an interesting difference from what you'd expect in other parts of the country. So the sort of actions that were taken by the school board to implement the Education Scotland Act, They were supposed to ensure that all children aged between 5 and 13 actually attended school. So one of the first things they did was to actually do a census of the children, using the ministers and other people like that would go around each area and find out how many children there were were within the age of 5 to 13. So the total number of children recorded was 1,733. That was for the parish of Stornoway. So that included 440 for the borough of Stornoway itself. And the other districts which were included in the census were the crofting townships that are part of the parish. So the usual Sandwick Hill, Home, Steinish. I've just listed them there to let you see what's there. They also, as part of setting up, well, they had to decide where they were going to locate the schools, and so they had to also decide which schools that were pre-existing could be reused if the current people that ran those schools were willing to transfer them. So this minute book's actually quite a useful source for finding out which schools were around before the 1872 Education Act, and that's quite an interesting piece of information that I wasn't expecting to find there. Now, this was something else that I found interesting. The school board elections were held every 3 years, and in the list of candidates for April 1885 there is actually a woman candidate, Mary Ann Reid, widow. I'm not sure if anyone would know who Mary Ann Reid was, or how she ended up standing for the school board, but I thought that was very interesting. But, you know, I don't know who Mary Ann Reid was, but maybe someone could do a bit of research on that. I've just put in a few points of interest. Actually, almost every page is interesting, so it's just a few snippets. So 24th of June 1886, I think you'll probably be able to make out on the left-hand page there's a thing that says urgent, a heading that says urgent. That was calling the meeting. And on the right-hand page is a report of the meeting. So the clerk stated that the meeting had been called hurriedly for the official purpose of giving instructions to the various teachers in the parish with regard to holidays, as several applications had been received by him within the last 2 or 3 days from teachers, pointing out the urgent necessity of granting holidays forthwith, as children were being withdrawn from school for agricultural labour and other reasons. So that just gives you a small flavour of what's happening there. This is a correspondence between the board and what was called the Highland Minute Grant, which again I would need to do a bit more research on, but I'm guessing this was a grant available to the Highlands and Islands from somewhere in government officialdom to give them more money because they realised they were under particular challenges. But this says the board directed the clerk to inform their lordships that owing chiefly to the extreme poverty of the population and frequent epidemics, it is almost hopeless to expect better results, however desirous the board may be to enforce the compulsory clauses of the Education Acts. Now, what this was about was that the grant was dependent on the rate of attendance of the children. So the school inspector's reports would say how many attendances it had out of the total possible number, and the school board of Stornoway was not very pleased with this because they were saying that they were actually needing the money more than other parts because of extreme poverty, and it was the extreme poverty itself that was causing the low attendance. So they were in disagreement with the fact that the amount of grant was dependent on the level of attendance. We've also got, believe it or not, free school meals. Quite an early time to be getting free school meals, but I like the way that they were to pay the people that were making the meals. So the minute book states the clerk was instructed to inform all the teachers in the parish that it is hoped that the free meals are now all in working order, and they are requested, unless something insuperable appears to the contrary, to give the meals in the afternoons rather than in the mornings. They were authorised to employ a suitable woman in each school to cook the porridge, etc., and to remunerate her at a reasonable rate by supplies of meal and syrup. The treasurer was authorised to pay the cartage of meal, etc. to the various schools. So some poor women were being employed to cook school meals and they were being paid in porridge, basically. So that's just a few examples of the sort of information that is in the school board minute books. And as you can see, they're a really amazing information resource. So moving on to the poor law records. Now I've given a little bit of background there about the Poor Law Scotland Act. This Act established parochial boards, established a central board of supervision in Edinburgh, and under the Act, inspectors of the poor were appointed. That's just a very, very brief summary of what the Act did. But because the new poor law was so rigorous, the records themselves are very detailed. And so the records for Stornoway Parish Council include registers of applications for poor relief, minutes of the Stornoway Parochial Board, registers of the poor, and assessment rolls. That's just some of the records. We've got more than that. I was saying to someone before the talk started tonight, we were talking about how awful it was in the past for people who were poverty-stricken and the way they were treated by officials. But these records are really an incredible information resource for all sorts of aspects of social history. For example, immigration, social and economic conditions, disease and illness, occupations, housing and family history. I should say that for obvious reasons the records are closed for 100 years. So that means that we wouldn't show anyone anything within the last 100 years. Now Shona here, who was waving earlier, when Shona began working in the Tasglann last year, I asked Shona to look into the poor law records, and they do really bring home how terrible conditions were for people in Lewis at this time. So Shona discovered a lot of interesting material. Due to time constraints tonight, I can only just show you a small snippet. This is an example of what the register looks like, the register of applications. So in the left-hand column, it's got the people on whose behalf the poor relief was being applied. So in this case, there are 3 names listed, and they're actually the children of the applicant. And the children's ages are 4.5, 2.5 and 1. And the information itself, the text in the middle reads, applicant's wife died 28th August last. He has no land and has a house outside village dyke. He holds the 7th share of a long line fishing boat. His fishing line he lost at sea about 2, and it just says about 2, so I'm guessing it must mean 2 weeks ago, and is unable to replace it. Applicant's father is a crofter in Vattisker, married a 2nd time. The stepmother in this case has until recently been attending upon the applicant's eldest children, allowing him to earn for them by fishing, etc. The youngest child is being reared by maternal grandparents in Babel. Applicant is now in a sickly state of health and unable to provide maintenance for self and children. So one of the features of the poor law was that any men of working age were ineligible unless they were proved to be too ill to work, but you could apply on behalf of children. So the records themselves, although they're made for sad reading, are very, very rich in information. Quite often, for example, in the initial application, the person would have to give a lot of information about their family and why the family couldn't support them. So quite often you'll find information about people's sons and daughters having immigrated or moved to Glasgow or something like that. So there's lots and lots of information in the poor law records. So I'm just going to finish on something a bit cheerier, which was the borough. In the same box as the charters, we found a set of borough posters or notices. These give just a brief flavour of what's going on in Stornoway from about the 1920s to the 1950s. So we found this poster for an indignation meeting, and it was to discuss the conduct of business as presently conducted by the Stornoway Trust. Now, I'm not quite sure what an indignation meeting was, but it doesn't sound as if it was very good for the Trust. But we did find a report in another source from 1924 about an indignation meeting in Babel, and that was crofters complaining about the way in which, hang on, I brought it here, they were talking about the absence of relief work for the unemployed, and a large group of them met in Babel Public School. This was in 1924, and that's also referred to as an indignation meeting. So I think it was if crofters had complaints. I don't know, maybe someone else knows more about these indignation meetings. This is another protest. So there was a protest about the action of the Herring Industry Board in prohibiting the curing of herrings after the 27th of August. And that poster is from August 1938. So I'm not quite sure why the Herring Industry Board brought in the prohibition, but obviously there was going to be a lot of people protesting in Stornoway Town Hall. This was also another interesting poster that we found. A public presentation, a public meeting of inhabitants of town and district will be held in the Town Hall on Monday 14th of January 1935 for the purpose of presenting awards from the Royal Humane Society and the Carnegie Hero Fund Trust to Mr. Roderick MacLeod McKeever, 3 School Park, Knox, Stornoway. And that's dated January 1935. So again, I think this needs a bit more research. I'm not sure exactly what Roderick MacLeod McKeever had done for the Carnegie Medal, but obviously he'd done something very impressive. There's also quite a few posters relating to entertainment in amongst these posters that we found. So a grand dance will be held in the Town Hall by the officers and men of HMS Effingham on the 19th of July. That's from the 1930s. And entertainment is going to be provided by the Wido Dance Band, which I think you might have some information about in the Stornoway Historical Society's archives. And then on the right hand side there, a programme of entertainment given by concert party from HMS Norfolk in the Town Hall, Stornoway, on Tuesday 7th June 1932. So I ran out of time, or I would have opened that programme and scanned it so that I could show you what was on the programme. But it just goes to show there was probably lots going on in terms of entertainment when all the ships used to come and dock. I'm guessing that from these posters that we found. So I hope that this dip into the archives has shown you what an incredibly information-rich resource they are. And what you've seen tonight represents just a fraction of what we have. Also hope that I've shown the sort of information, the breadth and depth of the information contained in the records and how they could be used to research a lot of aspects of the history of Stornoway. And anyone who would like to come to the archive to use the records for research is welcome to come and visit and come and use the archives in the reading room at the Tasglann. So I'll stop talking now and give an opportunity for questions. Thanks.
Oh, well, thank you very much, Shona. It was a very, very detailed look at the public records in Stornoway. I've certainly been noting down some questions that I have. Questions may not be able to be answered tonight, but some of them might be answered by some research within our own society. So, does anybody have any questions, suppose?
Yes.
Seems like a really interesting record and one that will become more valuable going forward. I guess I have a question about sort of the archive process itself. Was that today it seems like an important thing to do to archive things, but how do we archive things in a way that we can access them in the future when sort of, we're unsure about, say, 100 or 200 years what computer systems are available.
Do you mean records from nowadays? Yeah, that's one of the big challenges. Funnily enough, I've been working on with some people in the Corla, because you've got to implement what's called the Public Records Scotland Act, and that means that the Corla's got to make provision for any records that they create which are of enduring value. So the important thing about an archive is not really the format of the record, but whether it's worth keeping for permanent preservation. So the formats could be paper, parchment, plans, drawings, photographs, and digital records should be treated the same as paper records in terms of deciding whether it's worth keeping them. But you're right in that they're much more challenging, because you could have a paper record from 2,000 years ago that you can keep and still read, and something that was made 20 years ago on a computer could be completely corrupt and in a format that nobody can read. So trying to find a way to solve that is one of my, so I'm going to do this for next year.
Yes, as I said at the outset, Tasglann and Eilean has been very, very supportive of the various societies by providing guidance and help about the procedures involved in archiving. And my short phrase about that is that today's news is tomorrow's history, so it must be recorded. It's extremely important. I've got actually one question. When I was concentrating on the screen and mention was made of the Hogue on Keith Street, I was conscious of a couple of heads nodding. Does anybody have an idea?
Well,
Hogue?
It's halfway down Keith Street. It was on the left-hand side, and there's numerous families in it, but I think Walston can tell us more about it. It's something that the journalist...
Well, exactly, buy the journal and you can read all this.
On a Navy ship, that was, conditions on board the ship were pretty heinous, and the conditions in the Hog were supposed to be similar. And that's why it got the name.
Was it what was called a lodging house?
Sort of. Well,
Yeah, it was named after it was an HMS Hogue, and the accommodation on board it was so horrible that the accommodation in Stornoway was roughly the same. So
Okay.
the Hogue.
The accommodation at the Clactory before it was demolished was much better
Than before?
than what's referred to there.
Yeah,
There
yeah.
were some families who stayed there.
Yes. So it was
One of
improved.
the brokers was there.
Yeah.
in the 60s, I
It
think.
was opposite where Murray Place is today.
Yeah.
These flats are.
It was still occupied well into the 60s.
Yeah.
3 stories.
Was it owned by Bain and Morrison latterly?
I think so.
I think it was.
But it got its name in the 1860s.
Yeah, yeah.
Probably didn't.
Yeah, well, I would hope it would improve. I think that letter was from the 1870s, so maybe it wasn't.
I was also interested by a particular date, and one of the slides there, the opening of the Nicholson Institute on the 27th of February 1873, under the name Nicholson Institution. There was reference there to Nicholson Institution 1870, which is interesting. There must have been some activity before the formal opening.
Yeah, I think I've got the records of the trustees of the Nicholson Institution, and I haven't actually looked at the list for a while, but I think it's a lot of letters back and forth about the actual gift of the money and how they were going to set it up and all that sort of thing. So yes, sort of preparations for the opening of the Nicholson. Yeah.
Okay, any other questions? Ken?
Yeah, what about the horse?
The horse. What do you want to know about the horse? Shona, can you remember what there is about the horse?
What was his name?
We were actually amazed. We were amazed. What you tell them what we were amazed about, Shona, with the horse.
Oh gosh, I'm trying to remember now. It was
in the ledger.
Yeah, there's a whole page dedicated to the Borough Mayor. It's just called the Mayor in the in the ledger, and he got quite a lot of money spent on him.
Yeah.
So there was the vet's bill, the ferry bill for getting him onto the island. There was the bill for the scavenger that actually used him, because the mayor was used to pull the cart that the scavenger used to clean up the manure that was around the town. There was
the blankets.
The blankets for keeping him warm. There was hay. There was all the bills basically for at least a year, and it cost the town, I think it was £27 sterling or something to look after the mayor.
Yeah, the mayor cost more than the scavenger.
Yes.
So history comes round. The council looking after a horse now. On a more serious note, the business of the rags from Egypt. There was a time when they were plundering the Nile Valley, when they were adventurers, plundering all the tombs. And they were sending over here tons and tons of mummified small animals, wee tiny birds, to rodents and such like that. I mean, thousands of these animals were mummified to be put in the tombs. And people from here shipped out thousands of tons of stuff back to this country for fertilizer. And it was simply ploughed into the land. So perhaps that smelly stuff that was referred to as rags from Egypt could have been mummified animals.
Yeah.
By the time to be used as stuff. It was certainly done in, Liverpool area, in Lancashire area. Whether it got further north or not.
Yeah, that's possibly an explanation. Thanks for that.
Any other questions? Yeah.
Can you tell us something a bit more as to how this 100-year embargo operates?
Well, any records that we hold, if they have information about individuals, which is considered what would you call it? Information that identifies individuals, which is covered by the Data Protection Act, would have, the records would be closed for 100 years. So in general, when any records come into the archives, we look at the sort of information that's in the records. So the idea is to try and make the archives as open and accessible as possible. But if there is any information that could cause, well, for a start, you're not allowed to divulge information about living individuals. So for, things like school admission registers, for example, they're closed for 100 years. Hospital records, the sort of, just common sense really. If it's got somebody's name, address and any information about them, then it's covered by Data Protection Act. The reason it's 100 years from the last date of entry in whatever it is, say if it's a volume of letters or records, you would look at the last date. So the records might cover, say, 1910 to 1930. So that volume would be closed until 2031, 1st of January 2031. So it's really just common sense. School logbooks, for example, they're supposed to be closed for 30 years, just because of the information that's in them. And in some cases, you've got to check the logbook to see if it's got any more sensitive information than you would expect, in which case it would be closed for 75 years. Records relating to adults, you would probably apply a closure of 75 years. So for example, if someone applied to, say, a charity for financial assistance, you would close that for 75 years. So there's different closure periods depending on the sort of information that's in the record and whether the people in the records at the time are children or adults. Does that help?
Any other questions? Okay. Well, it only remains for me, on behalf of Stornoway Historical Society, to thank you for this very detailed and interesting look at the public records of Stornoway. I think we should all accord Shona a very hearty vote of thanks.